So I'd like you to picture for a moment, if you will, that you are a survivor of a shipwreck. You successfully survived the initial impact and you were hurled into the water, and you managed to have enough presence of mind to grab a hold of something that was floating there and held on for dear life. And of course, at that time, you assumed that a distress signal had gone out and that a rescue boat would be along shortly. But as the day deepens into night and then the night brightens into the dawn of the next day and there's still no rescue boat, I think by that time you would begin to have a shift in approach of things, realizing that you're going to be in this situation for a lot longer than you had hoped, and you might begin to revise your strategy and maybe find something that you could paddle with a little bit and get some kind of sense of where the nearest shore might be so you could kind of move in that general direction. And for me anyway, this is kind of how I feel with this situation of the pandemic. And of course, we all remember that last spring, how it felt, and well, we're going to be in this for maybe 8 weeks, and those 8 weeks seemed like an interminable amount of time. But after that, well, we can creep cautiously forth, and things will gradually get back to some semblance of normalcy. But of course, for every step we made forward, it seemed like there was a step made backwards, and things closed again. Then they opened again, then they closed again, and now we're deep into what they're calling the second wave of this thing. And even though vaccines are being developed, it looks like, probably the middle of next year before it might be around and distributed enough to make any kind of dent in this thing. So we're in this for the long haul. And back a few weeks ago, I was contemplating nature, and as I often do when the outer world gets chaotic, just like I did back in my adolescent days when my world seemed to be falling apart, I'd always spend time in the woods. And while it didn't solve any of my problems, it just being in that ordered, peaceful, beautiful place, it just kind of helped me to reframe and recenter, and I always felt better when I came back. So in this time contemplating in nature, I was there in a peaceful and receptive state, and the phrase came to me, the long enduring. And apart from the obvious meaning of this phrase, it has a special meaning for me because back when I first started getting into metaphysics, I was a student of the ancient Chinese book of changes, the I Ching, and the long enduring is actually one of the aspects, one of the hexagrams, if you will, of the I Ching. And so what I'd like to do is tap the wisdom of this very ancient oracle, and by way of getting some perspective on our situation here so that we can fortify ourselves for this long haul, however long it proves to be. So the I Ching is very ancient. The written tradition of it goes back about 3,000 years. The oral tradition of it goes back before then. And according to the folklore, it was the first emperor of China, Fuxi, who discovered it, if you will, and he was also contemplating nature. This is a great Oriental pastime, and you see this reflected in a lot of their art and so forth. But the story goes he was down there by the riverbank, and as he was down there in contemplation, a turtle crawled up out of the river and onto a log and began to sun itself. And as it sunned itself, the shell began to dry, and Fuxi was fascinated by these beautiful colored patterns that were on the back of this tortoise. And I guess he kind of had an epiphany of sorts, because he began to realize that these markings on the shell of the tortoise in some way reflected the ceaseless interplay of the yin forces and the yang forces, and what the turtle ate, and the rise and the fall of the river, and the weather that caused the rise and the fall of the river, and shaped the hillsides, and that shaped the emperor itself, and that somehow all of this was depicted in these symbolic markings on the back of this tortoise. And so it developed into a system of oracles, and they actually originally used tortoise shells to cast oracles and have a sense of what universal forces were in play at the moment. And as it evolved, it boiled down into what they called hexagrams, which are a series of 6 horizontal lines, which are either solid lines, which represent a yang or active masculine force, or a yin line, which was a yielding or broken line, which represented the yin force, the feminine passive force. And the permutation of 6 horizontal lines with 2 possible line types within each position gives you a total of 64 hexagrams, which is the basis of the written I Ching. And it's kind of a finite subset of the infinite universe. And number 32 of these hexagrams is called Heng, which is translated as the long enduring. And there you see it depicted there. And so what I'd like to do is draw upon this ancient wisdom of this oracle to give us some perspective as we go forward. And there are 3 aspects I'd like to talk about of this long enduring, and for sake of a memory aid, I have a little alliteration scheme going, and these 3 aspects are perseverance, purpose, and principle. Now, let me say, to begin with, a little more about the I Ching. This hexagram number 32, well, they divided these hexagrams into 2 trigrams, the upper 3 lines and the lower 3 lines, and the ancient Chinese saw pictures in these trigrams. So in the case of hexagram number 32, you see the upper trigram is actually called Chen, which they say is the arousing or thunder, and then the lower trigram is called Sun, which is the gentle or wind. So hexagram number 32, which is the long enduring, actually is the picture of thunder over wind. Now, the first thing, though, that strikes me about this is that there seems to be a paradox, because here you have the idea of enduring, and yet you have 2 ephemeral weather conditions that are pictured in this hexagram. And how can that be? Well, the simple answer is that to the ancient Chinese mind, they saw all, the only constant is change. It's the book of changes, the ceaseless flow of seeming opposites, yin to yang and back to yin again. But all these changes come about by ordered and predictable and immutable laws. So the same way that thunder, while it appears to be for a moment, it arises through the charges in the atmosphere that cause the lightning, which causes the thunder, or the wind, the changes in the pressure gradients, and you can predict, how fast it's going to be and what direction it's going to be. So beneath all change is the constancy of immutable law. Now, couple definitions though here, because we talk about perseverance and we talk about endurance, and it's well to make a distinction of these 2 things. So endurance is actually the inner spiritual quality. It is the stamina, the inner strength of the character of stance. And the result the resulting outer action of endurance is perseverance, which is defined as consistent action in the face of seeming opposition. Now, I certainly had a lot of seeming opposition this past summer, which I spent in San Diego, and of course it was difficult in the pandemic. Every place was closed. I was actually doing a little house hunting for a while, but everything was closed, and it was challenging, as it still is. But then on top of the pandemic, I then came into a pain-demic, which was a second challenge for me because I developed a toothache in the middle of all this. And I thought, well, no big deal. I didn't like the idea of going to a dentist and have somebody put their fingers in my mouth when there's a pandemic going on. But, I said, well, they'll pull the tooth and that'll be that. But as it turned out, it wasn't that, because in the process of doing that, it created an even more painful situation, and it just went on, and there was this circumstance. It was a whole labyrinth of circumstances there, and the pain just went on. And yes, I did have pain relievers, but there's only so many of those you can take. And it was Shakespeare that said that he never met a philosopher that could endure the toothache patiently. Because if you've ever had a toothache like that, it's so literally in your face. It's just so visceral. And in my case, it moved around. First it was down here, then it was up here, then it was by my ear, then it was in my back of my neck, then it was in my cheek. All the nerves, just kind of a symphony of misery. And you can be as metaphysical as you want, and you say, well, just think of something else. But when you're in that kind of pain, all you can think about is A, either the pain, or B, when is it going to stop? And I just don't know how people, before pain relievers, how they stood it and kept their sanity more than a couple days. But this went on for weeks. So, but the oracle, and the thing of it is, after a point, it really started boring into my psyche, and it really kind of moved me off of who, caused me to think about myself as just from a physical standpoint rather than a spiritual standpoint. And we're going to talk about that, because if there's one thing you need to build this endurance, is to have a sense of who you really are. But I was beginning to be moved from that by the inexorable 1-2 punch of the pandemic and the pain-demic. But here's what the oracle says. Very cryptic, very terse in one place in this hexagram 32. It says, perseverance furthers. It furthers one to have somewhere to go. And that segues neatly into the second topic here, which is the topic of purpose. Somewhere to go, a purpose. And of course, is there an absolute purpose, that we're here for? And if there is, it probably has something to do with giving and receiving love unconditionally. But I think it's kind of like back in the good old days when everybody was single and there was a lot of spiritual teaching around, finding a life partner and all this. And, so I remember some of the teaching all so well. They said, oh my gosh, you got to be prayed up and watch every minute, because if you're in a room and God's chosen one for you comes in that room and you happen to be behind the door and your eyes don't meet at that precise preordained moment, that you're forever condemned to second best, if that. And so you really got to mind your P's and Q's. But I don't think the universe is that way. And I think it's the same with purpose. I think, the scripture says that the gifts and the calling of God are without repentance. And that means that God is not an Indian giver. God did not give us spiritual gifts and then take them away. God did not call us and then sometime later rescind the call. And I think it is through the exercise of our spiritual gifts that we can find purposes, and these can shift. And I think we're going to talk about that in a minute. it's important to be flexible about these things. It's not one thing or nothing. And it reminds me of a man I met. He was 96 years old. I met him up on a men's retreat, and he couldn't walk very well, but he had a walker with knobby tires, and I always used to joke that if I made it to 96, I wanted to have a walker with knobby tires, which is great, especially in the mountainous areas there. But he had like 5 or 6 different careers, and they were all so different. I mean, he had been a surgeon, he'd been a film director, and 3 or 4 other things, and I'm sure he found purpose in each and every one of those things, and probably is what kept him alive to that age. But again, the idea that we need to be flexible, and this takes me back to a visionary experience I had as a young man, and suffice to say I was in a unitive state of consciousness, which basically means that the inner and outer worlds, the veil between the two inner and outer worlds was very thin. And it was a windy day, and I was outside, and these big eucalyptus trees were bowing before the wind, and I'd been struggling to accept what was, and specifically had been struggling to accept my sexual orientation. And the universe, through this wind and through the bowing of the trees, was saying, basically, bow before what is, accept what is, go with the flow. And then I looked up at part of the tree that wasn't bowing before the wind. There were these rigid branches there because they were dead. And I said, oh my gosh, if the wind gets any stronger, it's just going to snap them all off like toothpicks and scatter them to the 4 winds. And so, again, it was the universe just speaking to me to be flexible, to accept what is and go with the flow. Here's what the oracle says. True endurance is not based on rigidity, because endurance implies flexibility, not being locked into position. Only by adapting to change can we stay in the race, and only by deepening our sense of purpose can we call forth the strength to win it. But now I want to go into the third idea, and that is the idea of principle. And right away, when I say principle, as good students of the science of mind, you think of principle with a capital P, the idea that what we fervently hold as true in consciousness tends to manifest as our experience. And of course, Ernest Holmes was very clear on this, that we are not just to talk about principle, but we are to prove it, meaning that we are to actively take a stance in consciousness according to the spiritual truth of the matter, and that by taking that stand in consciousness and speaking our word in alignment with that and embodying that truth, that we would persist until the outer reality mirrored the inner quality, which is known, of course, as a demonstration. But principle with a small p, of course, refers also to basically the deepest aspect of our character, those bulwarks which, if we were to deny them, we would be seriously denying ourselves. And, of course, Jesus had a parable. And in the parable, he said that there were 2 builders, and one person built his house upon the sand, and another built his house upon the rock. And then he said, when the winds arose and the floods and the rains came, they beat upon the houses, and of course the house that was built upon the sand collapsed, and the house that was on the rock endured. And it all had to do with what was under that foundation. And so what we can say about the trials of life as they're beating upon us, they're really asking us the question, who are you really? Now, what is the foundation? What is the essence of your being? What is the locus of your being? Where do you locate who you really are? Is it in the flesh? Is it in the soul? Is it in the spirit? And the scripture is very plain on this. if we live after the flesh, we shall die. But if we, through the Spirit, do discount the deeds of the body, we shall live. Because Spirit is what? Formless, birthless, deathless, God, only wise. And of course, we know that this flesh will perish, one day will perish. So, but do we really believe that we are pure spirit, that we are God and we are God itself? Do we really believe this? And of course, that is the question that these fiery trials of life impel us to answer. Now, getting back to the I Ching, the ancient oracle, it was ancient when Confucius lived, and he wrote commentaries on these different hexagrams. And this is what he said about hexagram number 32. And he had this idea, the ideal person to him. Some places it's translated as the superior man, but I don't know, that can be misunderstood. I think the idea here is that it's the conscious person. The modern vernacular, we would say the conscious person. So he says this. It says, thus the conscious person stands firm and does not change his direction. He always keeps abreast of the time and changes with it. What endures is his unswerving directive to the inner law of his being, which determines all his actions. And on his further commentary, he says this. The seasons of the year follow a fixed law of change and thus can produce effects that endure. So likewise, the conscious person embodies an enduring meaning in his way of life, and thereby the world is formed. And again, that suggests that, again, if we hold to our inner compass, that again, the outer is manifest as a reflection of the inner truth, the inner stance in consciousness. So, we've been talking about the long enduring. We talked about perseverance, how that differs from endurance, because endurance is the stamina, the inner stamina. Perseverance is the resulting activity, consistent activity in the face of seeming opposition. We talked about purpose, that it helps us to have a purpose to galvanize ourselves, and that we need to have a stance of being flexible rather than rigid, moving with the changes, but always aware of our inner purpose and our inner gifts which come from God. And we talked about principle, that the bulwark of our character, that the foundations of our very life, which are discovered when the fiery trials of life, when the trials of life assail us, and because they're really asking the question, who are we? And how we answer that question makes all the difference. If we are fleshly, we shall die. If we are spirit, then we are immortal, invisible, and we are God itself. Final quote from Edwin Chapin. He says this, not in achievement, but in endurance of the human soul does it show its divine grandeur and its alliance with the infinite. So blessings to you today, peace with strength and endurance. Namaste.